Canada does not need any more reason to consider the particularity and uniqueness and uh, the metaphysical differences amongst everyone who lives here. That is not what the present moment calls for. What we need is unity.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. Canada is described by some as the world's first post-national state, a place with no core identity and multiculturalism as the defining feature of public life. But what does that really mean? Is multiculturalism a strength, a liability, or simply misunderstood? It's been a policy and political ideal for over 50 years, yet its meaning has shifted dramatically since Pierre Trudeau introduced it. It began as a national unity strategy, in fact, but for many, it's become a slogan about diversity for its own sake. That's left us divided about what it means to be Canadian. It's definitely more than an abstract debate. At MLI, we're looking closely at how immigration, national identity, and multiculturalism affect social cohesion, political stability, and our capacity to share a common civic culture. They're definitely not academic questions. They're at the heart of our future as a nation. And to dig into this, I'm joined by two great guests. Geoff Russ is a journalist and writer whose recent work on Canadian national identity for MLI, in fact, examines how our history, symbols, and traditions shape who we are today. And Michael Bonner is a historian, a former Ontario government policy director, and worked for the federal government, and the author of In Defense of Civilization. He's written recently on immigration policy and for MLI on multiculturalism, its origins, evolution, and current challenges. And just before we get started, I want to remind people to please like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these ideas. Geoff, Michael, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with you, Geoff. In your piece, you push back against the idea that Canada has no core identity. What, in your view, is at the heart of our national identity, and how does it differ from other countries?
Well, I think the one thing to keep in mind is that Canada is a young country, comparatively speaking. It's some people can say it's as old as Mexico. Go back 400 years to first contact. Some people say even further to the first Indigenous people in the country. Some say it's 1867. But I think the one thing that we shouldn't get away from is that Canada is part of the English-speaking world, and as a result, it's very difficult to craft a identity that stands out more than I think Canada or Australia does, and that is very much shaped by geography and our own particular political histories. But again, it is the history of people on this land that sets us apart. We don't have as grand a story as the United States or Britain or France, but we still have one. Maybe it's more subtle, more tame, but it is very much defined by English and Anglo-French coalition making a home in a very harsh, deadly climate with interactions with Indigenous people, Americans to the south. Those things can't be removed from it. I know people always try to say that Canadian identity is about always getting away from the United States. That's inescapable. But it's also inescapable that we have a British heritage, and the French speaking minority of Quebec also has their own particular heritage. But even in Quebec, they still, by necessity, share in the Anglo-American world today. You look at their participation, it's in both worlds. So I would say people tend to overthink Canadian identity. They think it has to be this grand narrative like the United States. When in reality, no, we're a former dominion growing into our own. We're very young as an independent state. And I keep saying that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We still have a proud history.
Mm-hmm. So why is it then, and I turn this question to both of you, that at least in elite circles, but I think it's fair to say in the broader population to a certain extent, there is this sense that, well, national identity, we maybe we look askance, like it's something that's problematic, or yes, that we should even transcend this sort of thing. Maybe particularly pronounced in Canada, but there is this sort of sense among, let's call them, the educated professional classes across the Western world. What do you make of this? Is it more pronounced in Canada? Like, is there something about the fact that we've our identity is in some sense rooted in, as you noted, Geoff, Anglo-French and Indigenous, kind of cultural and ethnic context. But are we past that? Are we beyond that or something? Michael, would you like to
Yeah,
start?
look, I don't see how anybody could ever become ever. You can't sort of become past something. I mean, it's conceivable that you can forget your history. That has happened many times in the past, and some sort of new narrative needs to be reconstructed or something. But the idea that we've all just reached a point where none of this matters, that's I don't see how that can be. I don't see how that can be true. But there was, I think that there are two main trends. One of them is the post World War II idea that you find in people like Karl Popper, whereby strong obediences and what the postmodernists began to call meta narratives are the source of conflict, and that you know the good life is is lived by constantly interrogating these things, questioning them, pulling them apart, and so forth. That's one thing that's infected, for lack of a better term, the entire Western world. But the other, peculiar to Canada, is the just quite simply the end of the empire. Canada's place in the world was very clear, obvious to everybody, whether you liked it or not. In the heyday of the British Empire, our role in the two world wars would be two very obvious examples of that. Again, whether you like it or not, I think that there was a great deal of anxiety among our elites in the middle of the 20th century as to what would become of our country as the empire declined and disappeared. And you can see a lot of the sort of new nationalism that came out in the 60s under Pearson and company as a kind of reaction to that. And the post national narrative, I think, grows out of it. Um, so this boils down, in my mind, first of all, to anxiety. Who are we? What are we doing? Why are we here in the absence of the empire? And then um, a second anxiety, or like a sort of growing obsession in the context of American dominance, almost like another empire. How do we fit into that? I think that's ultimately the root of it.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So on the one hand, you mentioned Karl Popper, open society and its enemies, this kind of revolt against particularity, rootedness, bonds, connection to one's past and people, and then our new place in the world. And I agree, there's a sense of anxiety. Geoff, you're perhaps with your piece suggesting, well, in fact, we do have some sources we can look to, but I'm sure you'd agree there is anxiety and kind of searching going on nonetheless. What do you make of this question of why we struggle so much with this question of national identity?
Well, I think to what Michael said, the post-war anxiety, and also the George Grant wrote about this. Also, Marshall McLuhan wrote about these things. Technology in the global village all coincides with the mass spread of digital and analog technology. So it only took about 15 years before kids who might have, I don't know, been playing at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in their backyard or watching the Ed Sullivan Show. Just the convergence of American cultural dominance and technology had a profound impact on Canada. And I think, I don't use the word distract, but it occupied a place that might have been occupied with nation building or soul searching, national soul searching. And there's one, and actually, Sarah, I just want to comment on something Michael said. about Canada's place in the world being part of the empire. It's quite remarkable. If you look at the First World War and the post-war negotiations, Canada had a far bigger role than it did after the Second World War, and there's a good reason for that. That's because Borden, very much an imperialist, very much believed in empire solidarity, was able to carve out a strong place for himself, was very aware of imperial affairs, and was treated with great respect. After World War II, with Mackenzie King's conscious slow decoupling from the empire and continentalism, they essentially were country bumpkins by comparison to the Americans and the British at the post-war conversation. So there were consequences to that, and it reinforces what Michael said.
Yeah, I like thinking of Mackenzie King as a bumpkin.
He was.
Very good. We'll return to our characterizations of Canadian prime ministers, as many will feature in the historical timeline here, I'm sure. But Michael, I want to ask you about your takes on multiculturalism here. You've noted that its shift from integration, the purpose of it, to integration into a harmonious system, to diversity kind of as an end in itself.
Hmm.
What sort of effects has this had on our sense of ourselves as a nation?
Well, I think it's had a very corrosive effect. But let's back up for a second. I don't think that a lot of modern people, perhaps almost none, are accustomed to thinking of things in terms of what their purposes are, or what the goal of a particular outlook, or even just a fact. I mean, if you observe that multiculturalism is a fact of life, as for example the bilingual bicultural commission did in the middle of the 20th century, it observes it simply as a reality in our country. The next kind of questions or observations that one would have after that was, well, what is it for, what is its purpose, and so forth. So I think that in the middle of the 20th century, the observation of a multicultural reality, or the existence of multiculturalism in Canada, was construed in a very particular way to mean that this is how we all fit in together into a unitary into a unitary country, and into a Canadian culture. Now, we look back on that and we think, well, that doesn't sound right. But or I think most people would think of it that way. Well, how do you get from where we are now, from there? Well, like it or not, that is how people thought about it. And you can see it in the Bilingual Bicultural Commission. You can see it implicit in the things that Pierre Trudeau and company said. Now, in the post-war world, I think it seemed obvious that this is how you sort of knit together a society, simply because everybody assumed that it wouldn't work, or it would be somehow pernicious to emphasize, as you say, the sort of deep rootedness and older, stronger obediences and narratives of the past, which many people blamed for the two wars. I think largely unfairly, but that's how I thought at the time. Now, the purpose of pluralism or diversity at the time was that there was a kind of, I don't know, a dialectic, if you like, between diversity and unity that would ultimately produce or continue to form the Canadian nation, the Canadian identity. And um, you know, there's some, at least philosophical merit in thinking that way, perhaps, but outside the context of the mid 20th century, I think that begins to make less and less sense, and that in the late 20th century, amidst rising globalization, the world of free trade, the sort of uh, borderless, united colors of Benetton world that everybody decided they lived in, that wasn't, that old idea of a sort of goal of unity no longer made a great deal of sense. Unity meant at the time, I think, something more like a single a single humanity above all particularism, above all local differences and so forth. People laughed at you if you preferred to be, sort of rooted in your village rather than a citizen of the world, or some such thing like that. Now, I think, having forgotten all of this, having lost the cultural context, I think that diversity has come to be the end in and of itself. And I would respond to that, and I would say, give people the benefit of the doubt. I would say, okay, well, what is it for? What is it actually for? What is the result that the diversity is meant to produce? I think that if somebody has produced an answer for that question, I've not heard it, and I suspect that it probably isn't a very good one. But if you look at our country now, as reflected, sentiments and so forth reflected in polling, or in sort of a general attitude, or just the vibe, whatever you want to call it, I don't sense that people wish for greater accentuation of differences. I think that there's a need for unity such as we've not felt in a very long time, and that tells me that the doctrine, or the philosophy of diversity is wrong or inadequate.
Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Geoff. But I just briefly, I mean, the older I get, the more I think of in these humdrum terms, of pendulums shifting and striving for balance. It seems you go from extreme to extreme, and that's where we are now. And but the comment of what diversity is for, I do think it is an end in itself, but there is like a proximate end it's tied to. It's just this foundational value of, everyone's happiness is found in being, very uniquely, expressively distinct and individual, right? Like, this is what I think it's like a foundational value of our society. Is a certain extent to which we need to lean into our uniqueness and particularity to reach that. But in another sense, there are certain objective features about us that make certain paths to the good life correct, or fulfilling, for lack of a better word. And interestingly, even the fulfillment of that, unique personal flourishing requires this collective, like all these collective manifestations of it, and we need shared life for that. We need common values, we need common practices, you name it. So I think that was really astute observation. But Geoff, would love to get your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, regarding diversity and multiculturalism, I would ask people who think Canadian multiculturalism is unique in the world, does it have differing attitudes towards multiculturalism than Australia does, or New Zealand, or modern Britain? They all speak the same language, the proponents of multiculturalism. There's nothing unique about Canadian multiculturalism anymore. Because we're the first, I think we've all arrived at the same conclusion. We we have the same menus on Uber Eats, we have the same diaspora conflicts, we have the same friends and family from the same backgrounds. It's all identical. It hasn't produced a different result in Canada. And we've had both the benefits and the consequences. I'm sure we all have great friends with parents from around the world, Middle East, Asia, Eastern Europe. But now we're also seeing the globalization of what were local sectarian conflicts. Now, do I want my Lebanese friends to stay? Do I want current tensions in Lebanon to be imported to Canada? No, not at all. I don't want Russian social values, Chinese political values, or Argentine economic values in Canada. I'm happy for the people that come. Absolutely. What you have to understand is that Canada's institutions, our economy, our governments, these are all cultural. And if you look at the way the world has gone since the end of the Cold War, democracy is proving to be very much a cultural feature, rooted very much in Western Europe and out of Britain. And it declines the further south you go and the further east you go. And think about the further east you go from Ukraine onwards, you don't really hit a truly harmoniously democratic country till maybe Australia, Japan. You can make an argument that Japan isn't really much of a democratic country anyway.
Mm.
So I do believe that when you start thinking about democracy in cultural terms, and Canada being a part of the democratic world, if that makes
I agree with that. Can I add something?
please.
I think that's very astute. And I would also add to the cultural element the theological formation of Western Christianity. Um, but apart from that, I think that this question as to what diversity is for, also it hinges on what you think people in society actually are. It's incoherent to suggest that the radical individualism breaks down both on in terms of individual human persons as well as cultures. You have to decide which one you're on about. If you can't accept, if everybody is sort of radically distinct, as some people have been insisting for some time, then there cannot be any cultures. So you get this kind of odd incoherence if you pursue both modes of thought at the same time, or one is taken too far. But at the same time, you will not find a culture that is somehow separate from individual persons, right? There's always going to be, just if there are no people, you won't have a culture. So the if diversity breaks down, if diversity for its own sake is essentially an ideology of globalization, you know, such as has just been described, we have to like the elites who push this sort of thing, they have to decide on which end of this of the two extremes they're going to fall. It's either radical individualism for absolutely everybody, or uh, cultures practiced by people that are interacting. And um, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has thought that through.
So it's a great point. I want to take your point, Geoff, about just how distinct the Anglosphere and Western democracies are. And Michael, you rightly noted that it's not just our more proximate political and cultural inheritance, but it's the deeper Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian culture that strongly informs it, even if many have forgotten it to a certain extent. Um, like there's so obviously something, because we have sustained this for a good period of time in spite of, I would say, all of these challenges with diversity and fragmentation, balkanization, all of that. So where do you think multiculturalism, insofar as it's responsible for that kind of maintenance but also fragmentation, where is it working and where is it failing?
Well, I think multiculturalism is
You want to go
working.
first?
Geoff, do you want to go
Or
first?
no, Michael, go ahead. Michael, go ahead.
I would say that it works in a very obvious sense, in which every place in the world is literally multicultural. That there are more than this. Like, I live in a town that is an hour and a half outside Toronto. It has a culture different than that of Toronto. It has an accent that is like noticeably different. If you listen from Scarborough, or wherever you pick. But you know, uh, multiculturalism fails insofar as what I just described is clearly not what the multiculturalists mean when they use that word, and they certainly don't mean. I mean, the example that I used in my little article, the, people don't think of post-Roman Britain as being, an example of successful multiculturalism, but there's a sense in which it actually was multicultural. It and Britain remains multicultural. Even um, centuries before Tony Blair, there were multiple cultures there. There were more than one language and different dialects and so forth. Like, in that very obvious sense, every place in the world is multicultural. But but the doctrine, the official policy, or what have you, or at least the way it's interpreted in Canada, is peculiar. It it not only does it no longer take into account the question of unity or kind of overarching narrative within which these different cultural things are recognizable, but it also, um, again, it makes diversity its own end, and it holds back. I would argue it holds back, or it somehow impedes the development of cultural interactions that would produce yet more variations on a local culture, because everybody is sort of tied to these um, sometimes arbitrary communities that they're associated with. And then secondarily, it makes, again, the official doctrine, it makes cultural expressions highly superficial. Food, I've found in my life that the greatest apologists for multiculturalism, they always reach for food first. All these different types of food in downtown Toronto. You can have a kebab right after you have uh, a crepe or something. It's like that's not multiculturalism. That's just like a variety of different food. Which sort of seems really really superficial. Um, so um, the so what that tells me is that there's a sense in which no particular doctrine or policy is needed. You just leave people alone; they will develop different cultures. They will be determined by geography, climate, by interactions, or by copying other people. Um, so you don't need it, and if you have it, um, such as we have defined it here, you actually end up getting not so much multiculturalism, but a kind of, I think you might, in some extreme cases, you might call it balkanization, or just simply a kind of pointillism, whereby these sort of different communities don't actually interact, or if they do, it's at an entirely superficial level.
Yes. It's like polite balkanization.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is equally disastrous in the long run. So everything just becomes sectional at the end of
Yeah,
the
Geoff, yeah, definitely. Geoff, what do you make of this question, strengths and failings?
One thing I would talk about the failings, actually, you can go back very far in Canadian history. If you think about one of the central questions of Upper Canada and Ontario was the Irish question and the battles between Catholics and Protestants. And was that necessarily good for Upper Canada and Ontario to have two sectarian groups of Irish people fighting each other for 100 years? I mean, did that produce harmony? I don't think it did. It took until 1960s for that to finally break. And I think we're seeing a similar phenomenon today, particularly with look at the attacks on the Jewish community in Canada, which have not abated really in Canada or the rest of the Anglosphere. So we are seeing, I think, another version of that Irish conflict happen again, and that does happen when these communities entrench themselves, and we don't give them. And one thing I always say, there's still the Canadian state has gone very hard on pushing multiculturalism, but they haven't pushed something to integrate into. And I think it is a two-way street. If you want to have a more unified society, the state does actually have to actively give something to integrate into. And people can say that that creates an artificial sense of culture, but if you go through history, whether it's the Italians or the French, all of them use state capacity to reinforce a common culture. So that's not uncommon. And but
Yeah, no, I think this is a good point. Oh, sorry, Jeff,
no, no,
continue.
please.
Well, no, it's a good point is that, as we've said a number of times, there are certainly similarities across, the Western world, Western democracies with respect to the cultural de-emphasis, but Canada is unique. And I tend to think of, multiculturalism as a fact in all of its forms, insofar as it, provides points of contact for people who are different and can lower these tensions between groups when you realize you're all just the same, more or less. They're all human beings. at the same time, it promotes kind of this like anti-culture. It's anti-cultural in a certain sense. It says that one cannot form, again, the terms of deep or thick, I think apply here. And you've noted the absence of this push to integration here. So Geoff, you've kind of said, well, no, we do. When you look around, people do have a national identity, and there are, descriptively speaking, very characteristic features of Canadian cultural life. But has multiculturalism the doctrine, because I would describe it anyway as anti-cultural in many respects, kind of really harmed our prospects at improving upon or revitalizing, whatever term you want to use, this cultural core that is pretty important for national identity.
Yeah, and I would say that we have examples of an alternative form of integrating what Michael said, like the multicultural society that he says has always existed. You look at Confederation, when British Columbia entered, we had a very old Chinese community in Victoria and Vancouver. So the term's fraught, those would be Canadians. If you're in Canada Confederation, I would say, yeah, you're a Canadian. You're of Chinese heritage and you have unique characteristics in that respect, but you're still part of that national fabric. But I think what's most important is that whether or not you conceive of yourself as being part of the Canadian fabric or a part. When you think about integration to Canadian culture, does that is that in opposition to your multicultural identity or your ancestral identity that falls outside of to the two founding peoples or another vision of a unified culture? So I think we've gone to the point where where integration is viewed as harmful, as discriminatory, which it isn't, because if you look around the world, again, we have capital M multiculturalism here in Canada, but we also have it in Australia, but we have the same results. So I don't think it makes much of a difference whether the state enforces it or not. It's whether or not the state wants to actively foster an integrated, unified society.
This is great. So let's turn now to policy applications of these sorts of questions beyond the Multiculturalism Act proper. I can think of Canadian heritage and culture, that sort of thing, but the biggest one, and certainly front and center today, is probably immigration. Um, Michael, I think you referred to, but I know you did a piece recently on immigration policy, polling that shows Canadians now believe newcomers should adopt broad mainstream values. Diversity can be a source of conflict. So, how should policymakers respond to this?
Well, I've written a huge, well, maybe not huge, a lengthy study for the Aristotle Foundation about this very subject, and um, I don't want to get into the weeds of it. People can go read it if they wish, but I mean, fundamentally, people want to have that core identity, the exact opposite of what Justin Trudeau said. They believe that there is a core Canadian identity and they want people to assimilate to it. They want to see it um, held up as a model, as something desirable for people to hold in respect, and so on and so on and so on. I think that almost everybody would agree with the well, I can tell you it's about 60% of people say that more needs to be done. Okay, according to the polling that I've seen recently, and it's arguable that is now getting higher. But the question is, what does that mean? The uh, the sort of grade 9 history thing, you're asked to define the Canadian identity and so forth, and then your teacher tries to outsmart you by saying, well, what do you mean by that? How do you know? I mean, like, you can do that in any place, in any country, and it's just stupid. People can recognize a Canadian culture and so forth when they see it, and as Geoff has alluded, it doesn't have to be peculiar or entirely exclusive only to this landmass, right? And the idea that it should be is a little bit preposterous. It's and the idea that you have somehow vanquished the idea of a core identity simply because you can find elements in common with other places is also just like intellectually stupid. So um, nevertheless, we have not done a good job in our country discussing these things and uh, not necessarily defining the identity, because I don't know if it needs any kind of uh, definition, but um, the uh, the problem. I mean, I can put it as a question for the current government. What is it that someone is supposed to integrate with? What is it that someone is supposed to adopt or not adopt or leave behind, uh, in terms of a value, or as a some sort of cultural touchstone? Well, that is where the difficulty comes. We had a citizenship guide that once included the phrase barbaric cultural practices that must be, outlawed, forbidden, avoided in Canada. And they included things like forced marriages, um, female genital mutilation, and a variety of other things. Um, when people poke holes in that kind of thing, they're concerned, as Justin Trudeau himself once said, concerned about vilifying certain groups and about creating, I don't know, some kind of tension or something. Um, and then they often pivot back to something like law. Well, they say, well, we have laws against these things. Okay, yes, we do. But the point is also that you have to adopt as a value. You have to value what the law says. What the law teaches. You have to adopt within yourself, and the actual spirit that sort of animates the law. And if you don't, and it's simply just I don't know. You're just following a rule or something. That's very different from actually having uh, from actually valuing something. Now, if you say to me, how are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to inculcate values and so forth? Well, part of it is that you have to live here for a long time. Part of it is that you have to be rooted in our culture, for many, potentially for many generations. And if it's, how many, I don't know, but um, the there's no quick fix, but at least we could start talking about these things, I think, uh, in a more sensible manner, and showing that, at least as far as elites are concerned, that we we take this sort of thing far more seriously than we used to.
Well, I think that's right in that there's no like single policy, as there really aren't for many things, but even a set of policy levers that you go aha, and or a definition of Canadian identity. Think about imposing these things, like it doesn't work, but a kind of public discourse, and acceptance of the idea that, well, there is in fact a common core, and its integration is something we should strive for, while ensuring things are not forced. Like that's the shift that needs to change. I find it interesting that now we are recognizing these more cultural elements of the question around immigration and multiculturalism, but it was first the housing issue, a pure kind of economic one, that got that broke the barrier, so to speak, the
Yeah.
taboo around this issue, which is really interesting.
Well, I think
And so, Geoff, I want to yeah,
sorry,
go ahead,
one
Mike.
thing, just I don't want to monopolize it, but I think that the housing issue and economic integration in general, those two things are actually grossly underemphasized, because if if you don't have a stake, and this applies not just to immigrants, it's also to millennials and Generation Z. If you don't have a firm stake in your community, you're not able to live there and own a part of it, you will not be integrated. And I think that that's one thing that governments could do to make it, to make everybody's life easier, would be to, fix that problem so that people feel more rooted than they otherwise would, and having a stake in it.
Yeah, I would say
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and that's a cultural issue more broadly. Like just all of this choice, it means people are floating around and they can't put down roots, they can't form bonds with people or connections. So, but Geoff, yeah, I want to get your thoughts on immigration policy here and this question on like the the role of the pace and scale and the type. How can we tweak some of these levers? And any thoughts you had on what Michael said thus far?
well, I would say don't create a modern underclass of people who feel different. That's a recipe for disaster. And there's numerous examples of that around the world. So you could see that often in the United States. Look at the Irish for a long time. Again, I'm not trying to pick on the Irish at all, but in the United States, they were an underclass for a long time. There was a lot of unrest, a lot of chaos there, a lot of clinging on to an older identity. Look at them; they donate to the IRA and the billions for a reason, because there was not that sort of acceptance in mainstream America. And the so I would say yes, do not import an underclass. That is a terrible decision. And the second one I would be just broadly about how do you foster integration? Actually, get institutional and elites talking about Canada as something rather than anything. Like, just try to create a culture where being Canadian is seen as something more singular rather than it has to be pluralistic. It has to be like I said, it has to be the world. Like, talk about Canada as not looking like the world. What can Canada offer the world in terms of something particular? As soon as you get people talking and thinking that way, I think you could see a huge shift. I think that is important. And like you said, there's no single policy option, but simply changing the language we're used to speaking about Canada with would go a long way.
Well, part of it must also be ceasing to ceasing to denigrate and sort of deprive the country of legitimacy. I mean, it's very odd. I think JJ McCullough, who I pay attention to him on Twitter from time to time. I think he had a sort of interesting quip about this, that you know you can almost there's practically no limit to the kind of things that the Canadian elite can say about our country in the way of its illegitimacy, its fundamental depravity, its its fakeness, and so on and so on and so on. But you cannot possibly question, the same people would never question official bilingualism, which is obviously a strange contradiction. But, you know, love it or hate it, our history is what it is. And, we're not going to be a very successful place if you believe. In fact, I mean, I don't even know what it means to say that the country is illegitimate. Like, the country is here. Like, it's just, we all live here, whether you like it or not. And, um, I even liberal politicians have sailed, I think, very close to the wind in recent years, discussing um, Canada in a way that makes it seem like an illegitimate, fake, artificial creation that is sort of bound for dissolution or destruction. I mean, that's an example of not what you should do, but what you shouldn't. I think we could probably make a long list of other things that the government and our elites could cease to do that would probably help a lot.
Yes, referring to Canada
Okay,
as
great. This has got us thinking about where I want to go.
I just want to say, like, referring to Canada
Sorry,
as
the lag, Geoff.
these lands we now call Canada is infuriating and toxic, right? Like don't speak
Yeah,
about the country as if it is a corporate project that is here purely due to the forces of colonial evil. And the other thing too is Quebec is treated as a national project, and the rest and the Rock is treated as a corporate propositional one. Why is that? And I admire Quebec for enduring in a dominantly English speaking continent. I mean, Quebecers have a right to exist and continue. Why does the rest of Canada
yeah,
not?
yeah. But so have we. I mean, I think, and I think that also the experience of Quebec in Confederation is not unique. Like, just go anywhere west of Ontario, like you will hear the same. It's like it's not west. It's people like Preston Manning and company. They were not railing against Toronto. They were railing against Ottawa, and the alienation of many of our western provinces from the Dominion government is very similar. to the kinds of things that Quebec rails against. But those are policy questions. Like it doesn't mean that there's somehow I don't know, no other cultural identity apart from Quebec. It just means that people are upset and uncomfortable with the federal government, which is, if anything, that's evidence that this is more of a real place than its critics uh, would have us believe. But that's a digression.
No, this is very good. This is where I think sets us up well for where I want to conclude, which is discussion on what next for multiculturalism and Canadian identity. We've talked a lot about the framing and how the framing maybe doesn't get it right. Some years ago, I actually proposed a metaphor for this. I think it works well for like bodily health and the health of the environment, where we get the term ecology. Harmonious functioning of parts for a certain end, and that's when our bodies are working well. As I would say, is when our societies can work well, when things are properly integrated. So perhaps we might, as you're suggesting here in this conversation, like look to policy, yes, but also to shifting the way we talk about some of these issues. So I want to get your thoughts on that first. Like, should we shift the way we think about what it means to have a healthy country here? Do you think that metaphor is apt? And I also want to build on your mentioning of Quebec, Geoff, because Quebec, it in some ways rejected multiculturalism, has its own interculturalism. And then we really haven't done enough time speaking about Indigenous perspectives as well, on how they complicate the national conversation. So, questions for you both about like what metaphor or what big picture way do we need to start thinking about what it means to have like a healthy, well functioning polity, and how that connects to identity and multiculturalism, and then these examples of Quebec and Indigenous peoples. Geoff, why don't we start with you?
Sure. One thing I found very interesting about the way at least Ottawa has tried to conceptualize Indigenous peoples is talking about three founding peoples. I'm not sure that's entirely correct. We have a First Peoples and two founding peoples, and that doesn't in any way delegitimize Indigenous people or take away from their place in Canada. But they've gotten to the point where they're trying to push what is essentially a narrative about Canada that just isn't rooted in the Constitution or history, for that matter. And I don't think it's actually worked. I don't think Indigenous people feel closer to Canada over the past 10 years. That's something we have to resolve, and it's not helped by talking about the country as one of settlers and of settlers and Indigenous. It's just cowboys
Mm.
and Indian Academy, and that is a huge problem. That is, well, it's true, and that is the popular discourse, and it just creates this inherent bad good dichotomy, because in what scenario are the settlers good in this setup? No, they're the villains of this. And if we talk about this country as one of inherent heroes and villains, then, like you said, it goes towards the delegitimization of it that you mentioned. And for newcomers to come here, they're not going to want to be part of a country that conceives of themselves as settlers. So I think doing away with that discourse would actually go a long way. And they started to question, how come the statues are being torn down? That's a symptom of a post-communist country, or a country that's undergoing a revolution of sorts. So it encourages rejection of Canada. So I think cracking down and doing away with that discourse would go a long way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would take it as far as to say that, like, even reacting to that discourse and saying, no, actually, no, you've misunderstood the fundamental nature of Egerton Ryerson, or here are the 200 reasons why Henry Dundas was great. And like I have done that. Like I've written in defense of Henry Dundas all the time, which I would never have done. I never even thought of Henry Dundas before until all of this nonsense uh, started. So now he's famous, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But playing into that, like constantly engaging with that paradigm, I think is silly. But it's a symptom of forgetfulness. That you can only get away with making these outrageous claims about historical figures because nobody knows who they are in the first place, and nobody has enough I don't know, like intellectual strength or something to look into them. Uh, so yeah, I would do away with that um, altogether. Um, but my fundamental point would be that official multiculturalism doesn't work um, to any demonstrably good purpose. It's either useless or superfluous or pernicious, um, and uh, it doesn't meet the present need. It met the need of the mid 20th century when there was when it was understood by everyone in a different way. Canada does not need any more reason to consider the particularity and uniqueness and uh, the metaphysical differences amongst everyone who lives here. That is not what the present moment calls for. What we need is unity. We need a sense of country and nation or nations. I don't care how many nations we say we are, as long as we can acknowledge that they're here. Um, and I also don't think that we should have any more terminological debates as to like what a nation is, or what is a country, what is this is all just kind of pointless hair splitting, and no matter what terminology we want to use, I think it's just high time we face the fact that the narrative or the vision of unity and diversity, diversity and unity, that's just fundamentally true of this country. But we have accentuated the diversity so much at the expense of unity, and it's time to think about the unity. And let's just start. There's no reason to put it off any longer. Now, I've also argued, just from a policy perspective, in different contexts, that I think that the era of mass immigration is coming to an end, partly for political reasons, partly for demographic reasons. There's just not going to be a huge number of people floating around the world looking to make their fortunes. That's I put money on that being the case, and numbers simply going down. In that kind of a world, what is it going to mean to be Canadian? What is it going to mean to be rooted in a place that is with a declining population, that is no longer accepting huge numbers of foreigners, not because we refuse them entry, but because they're not coming? What does it mean? Well, those are the things that we need to think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting how I think this very approach, multiculturalism, and its emphasis on immigration, has caused some of these, like social enemy and despair issues. People can't even, they don't aspire to have their own children, and it's certainly connected to national identity or a lack of a sense thereof. So very clear, Michael. Yeah, you've know we need to talk generally about unity. I think we've agreed today that multiculturalism, as currently practiced, is not delivering on that. So what should, in more concrete terms, replace or reform it? Geoff, I'd love to hear from you.
I think the model of interculturalism would be excellent in this regard as an evolution of Canadian multiculturalism. Like Michael said, multiculturalism made sense at one time. It doesn't anymore. At least the capital M multicultural. Like I said, lowercase multicultural is just simply the reality we live in. But interculturalism, like a dualism, to say perhaps your great grandfather is from Nigeria, that's fine. Have your traditions, your holidays, your foods, retain, say, the Igbo language if you can, and also recognize that you're here now and you will be here. And don't say you have to become Canadian. Be like, we want you to become Canadian as an upstanding person. It's not like we want to force you to do it. It's that we want you to be. I think having that kind of language would be tremendous.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Michael,
I,
yeah, any closing thoughts?
well, yeah. So I agree 100%. Um, the example I always pivot to is a real example. It is the example of post-Roman Britain and the evolution of a British first a common English identity, because that's the word that Bede used to describe everybody, and Alfred the Great picked up, um, later on, this idea of an Anglo-Saxon country. Like, if you actually think about that kind of terminology, it's absurd. Like, you can't just attach two names together seemingly arbitrarily, and then say, well, this is the new culture. But that's what was done. And it's just a question. It's not just a question of terminology. It's a question of fact, whereby, given enough time, a group of heterogeneous people managed to get along, and through interaction and contact, marriage, and so forth, managed to hammer out a unitary national identity, with all sorts of subcultures and dialects and languages and so forth, amidst constant invasion and social collapse. So this sort of thing can be done. It has been done, and the diversity still remains. But what came out of the mix was what the postmodernists would call a meta narrative, and I think that Canada will be no different. So let's just get out of the way all of these sort of strange abstractions that official multiculturalism foists on us, and stop preventing people from interacting. Stop the I think Geoff put it well. Stop the creation of sort of particularist subgroups that are constantly taught that they are aggrieved, or that other ones that they're constantly told that they're evil or whatever. Just put all that to one side, let it go, keep talking about it, and let nature take its course. And we will all be, we are all now Canadian. We will simply become more Canadian as we proceed.
Well, that was excellent way to conclude an example of how it can be done, and more organic than perhaps some design inclined people would like to believe. And quite right, Geoff. I think to stress that it needs to be freely chosen. And it needs to be an aspirational, positive ideal. We want people to become Canadian. Having something attractive to aspire to is the best way to go about it. So I want to thank you both for a fascinating conversation today. Please check out both of their work that they've published recently through the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and all the other great work that they do on various platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe so more people can hear these ideas. For MLI, I'm Peter Copeland. Thank you for joining Inside Policy Talks.